Hello, the video on Facebook Live was just too grainy, so I got to redo it. So I've been getting a lot of questions about the difference between depression, grief, and sadness. So I did this on Facebook Live, but I didn't like the quality of it, so I'm going to redo it over again. So I'm going to try to make this a little bit better. Go back over my story. Well, yesterday I got a call. One of my patients missed their appointment on Tuesday, and this patient never misses the appointment. And so after they missed, I said, well, they'll come back later in the week. And so they didn't call back, but their daughter called with an emergency on yesterday. So when they called back with emergency, I was like, oh, well. So I figured they needed some medications or whatever. So I picked up the phone and talked to the daughter. And the daughter said, well, Dr. Woods, I got some bad news for you. I was like, well, what is the bad news? Now, oftentimes as doctors, we don't want to hear the bad news because the bad news can mean a number of things. And the bad news essentially was that both her mother and her father had died of COVID-19. And that was just not something that I want to hear. But it reminded me of how human we all are. And, I've had an uncle, I've lost an uncle to this disease. Now I'm losing patients. And so it's just a lot. So I really want to go over some definitions for you. First of all, there's something called depression. And what we call it is we call it major depression. So you hear people say the word depression, but whenever you hear depression, think medical illness. The next thing you will hear is something called grief. And then the final thing you may hear people talk about is something that's called sadness. Now, sometimes you may hear these changed or used interchangeably, but you got to be kind of cautious with them because although they can be used interchangeably, they are very, very different. And there's a new one I want to talk about, and that's something called smiling depression. Now, major depression, like I said, I've trained you on that one before. That's when you're not sleeping, not eating, guilt, hopelessness, appetite disturbances. And that's those people that have the dreaded thoughts of suicide or ending their life. Major depression, usually the symptoms are around I would say the symptoms are usually around at least 2 weeks. And you can have a depressed mood or loss of interest. So you don't necessarily have to be depressed to have major depression. Remember that. You do not have to be depressed to have major depression. You can have loss of interest. You don't want to do anything. You just don't want to do anything. You don't want to go out. Just giving up on life. So this can be what we call a medical emergency. So that you need to get the person to the doctor. Grief is associated with loss. Now, the thing about grief can really last. It can hang around from 6 months to about 2 years. Now, you have to be cautious with grief because if the grief becomes too intense, it can flip into a major depressive episode. So there's some people that have grief. If the grief becomes too clinically intense, that person can experience a depressive episode. So you have to be very careful. Even though you can identify the loss, even though you can identify the stressor with grief, they can indeed go into a major depressive episode. Now, sometimes with depression, you may not be able to identify the specific issue that the person maybe have difficulty with. But sometimes you can identify the stressor, sometimes you cannot. Sadness. Sadness is usually something that lasts maybe like 2, 5, 6 days, but it's usually a reaction to something that you can identify. So, but it doesn't last a long time. Um, it's usually something we can, you can talk over with friends, pray about it, deal with it kind of within your own peer group, but it's not something that we would say needs a lot of clinical attention. Now, the one you have to be careful with is this one, the smile and depression. Now, the smile and depression people really belong over here. But what they will do is, these are people that really meet criteria for major depression, but what they tend to do is they tend to smile through their issues. So what is happening is there really are a number of issues that are there, but as opposed to dealing with those issues or really discussing those issues, they're basically, smiling. We just got to put up a front. So that's not necessarily good. Now, I'm not going to hold you too long tonight, but I just want to bring it to your attention. There's major depression, there's grief, and there's sadness. They're very, very different. Remember, major depression, that's 2 weeks of either loss of interest in everything or really, 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 really bad depressed mood. Intense sadness. Grief, loss, death of a parent, loss of a spouse, loss of a friend, loss of a partner, something that's very, very intense, 6 months to 2 years. Now, if the grief becomes very, very intense and you really begin to manifest a lot of sleepless nights, you're not eating, you lose a whole lot of weight, you probably now meet criteria for major depression, and that's what we call a double depression. And that needs to be treated. Sadness, something that's more transient, usually goes away on its own, talking in your peer group. Smile and depression, that's a mimicker, a great imitator, and that also has to be treated. So I just want to bring that, this little quick video, something to kind of go over some things with you. I am going to be back out here again. There's a lot we need to talk about. I've been off the scene. My new book is about to come out. It's at the publisher. A lot of these things are going to be talked about in detail in that book, because I really want you to become aware, and I really want you to learn more about how to differentiate these diseases, and I really want you to become cutting edge and learn how to help yourself stamp out this mental illness. Once again, enjoy yourself, and don't forget to come by and see me at the website.